You know, when we said we do a deep dive into anything,
I don't think either of us expected to be unpacking strategy notes from...
well, let's just say a being who prefers to remain nameless.
Right.
But here we are,
Your source material for this deep dive.
a series of letters between, shall we say, a rather persuasive entity
Called Malignos and their subordinate Shadowtick.
is giving us a masterclass in manipulation.
Masterclasses, right.
It's fascinating how these letters cover the entire spectrum.
Everyday vices like giving into lust, greed, anger.
Things most of us can relate to.
Right.
But it goes way beyond that, delving into how these basic temptations can be amplified.
And weaponized using things like social media or economic anxieties.
Issues that hit close to home for a lot of us.
Yeah, and before we even get into specifics,
The overall tone is chilling.
it's like Malignos is saying.
Let me show you all the ways I can twist the good and the bad in human nature to get what I want.
Yeah.
I mean, take this line.
Shame can be a most potent weapon, my dear Shadowtick, but it requires a delicate touch, a masterful manipulation.
That's Malignos in a nutshell.
Calculating and disturbingly poetic.
Yeah.
And this emphasis on subtlety really struck me.
There's a line where Malignos talks about how even the smallest of infractions can be like a pebble that sets off an avalanche.
Wow.
They're not looking for massive overnight transformations.
Instead, it's about slowly eroding someone's sense of self, their connection to others, their very grasp on what's true.
And this is where it gets really scary.
Right.
Because Malignos actually lays out how they'd use everyday situations
Paying bills, scrolling through social media.
and triggers for these negative emotions.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, who hasn't felt that pang of anxiety checking their bank balance?
Sure.
But Malignos wants to take that normal human experience.
And twist it into something darker.
Absolutely. Malignos even talks about turning comfort into complacency,
It's like they're saying, sure, enjoy that comfy life, indulge in those creature comforts.
right up until it makes you passive, entitled, and blind to the needs around you.
They're aiming to warp our perception of what a good life, a meaningful life really looks like.
Okay, so we've talked about how Malignos wants to mess with our emotions.
But what about our beliefs?
Like, how do they use things like religion or politics to manipulate people?
This is where it gets even more insidious.
Because Malignos recognizes the power of belief systems.
They specifically talk about exploiting religious rituals, encouraging people to focus on the outward forms of faith.
While neglecting the deeper meaning, the compassion, the connection,
Yeah, there's a passage where they're practically salivating.
over the idea of turning denominations against each other.
It's classic divide and conquer, right?
Exactly.
And the same goes for
Right.
politics.
One passage that really struck me was Malignos' strategy for dealing with figures like Biden and Trump.
Oh, interesting.
They're not interested in taking sides.
They just want to amplify the existing division, turning political figures into either idols to be worshipped or devils to be destroyed.
It's like they're saying, go ahead, pick your side, dig in your heels.
And for the love of all that's unholy, don't even think about seeing the other side's point of view.
Because that's where Malignos thrives.
In the echo chambers, in the spaces where people are so convinced of their own righteousness.
But they can't even fathom the possibility of another perspective.
And that black and white thinking
That refusal to see nuance.
says up again and again.
Like with the abortion debate.
Malignos is absolutely gleeful about the potential for chaos and pain there.
They explicitly instruct Shadowtick to prevent any common ground or understanding, to keep the focus so intensely on the act itself.
That people forget the humanity of those involved.
It's dehumanizing, plain and simple.
And Malignos uses that same playbook with climate change.
They suggest either denying the problem altogether,
Or going to the opposite extreme.
becoming so overwhelmed by it that you just give up.
Exactly. It's about pushing people to the fringes, to the points where they feel powerless or hopeless.
And that sense of powerlessness, that feeling like nothing you do matters.
Is something Malignos wants to cultivate.
So it's not just about pushing specific ideologies,
It's about creating a climate of despair, a sense that things are so broken.
that there's no point in even trying to fix them.
Precisely, and that's where they can really start to work their magic.
Because when people feel hopeless, when they feel like they have no agency,
They're much more susceptible to manipulation. They're more likely to cling to extreme views.
more likely to lash out at those who are different, more likely to give up on the very idea of a better world.
It's chilling, really, how calculated it all is,
It's like Malignos has studied human nature, found all the cracks and fissures.
and is now using that knowledge to pry us open.
That's why these letters are so valuable.
Because they're not just a glimpse into one being's twisted agenda.
They're a mirror reflecting back our own vulnerabilities, the ways we can be tempted, divided.
And ultimately controlled.
So how we fight back?
If Malignos is so good at exploiting our weaknesses, is there any hope for us?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Because in outlining their tactics, Malignos accidentally reveals something crucial.
Their own vulnerabilities.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting.
But I think we need to give our listeners a moment to process all of this.
We'll be right back to unpack those vulnerabilities and what they mean for you.
You see at the very end of the letters
There's this almost panicked note from Malignos.
about what might happen if their playbook, so to speak,
We're to fall into the wrong hands.
or in this case, the right ones.
Doors.
It's like they're saying,
Here's how to manipulate people, but don't tell anyone.
I'm sensing a bit of an own goal here.
Exactly.
They lay out 7 major vulnerabilities.
That come with this exposure.
Okay.
And the first one is so simple yet powerful.
Knowledge is power.
Makes sense.
If you know someone's trying to trick you.
You're less likely to fall for it. It's
Right.
like that whole thing about magic tricks.
They're only impressive when you don't see the mechanics behind them.
Right.
Malignos even admits that the more people understand these tactics.
The less effective they become.
Really?
It's like shining a light on a cockroach.
They scatter when exposed.
Yeah.
And this leads directly to the second vulnerability.
Unified humanity.
It's like they've been playing this divide and conquer game for centuries.
And now they're realizing that unity is their kryptonite.
Malignos hates the idea of people coming together
Sharing this knowledge.
because that collective awareness becomes a very real threat.
It throws a wrench in their whole plan.
And it's not just external unity that worries them.
There's also the fear of lost souls.
So are they talking about people leaving a particular religion?
Because of this,
Not necessarily.
it's bigger than that.
They're worried about individuals who, by understanding these manipulative tactics,
Wake up and choose a different path.
a path rooted in authenticity connection.
Maybe even, dare I say, goodness.
So Malignos is afraid of people becoming good.
No, that's a twist.
But even they can acknowledge that potential in humanity.
That's kind of hopeful, isn't it?
Exactly.
It reveals a fundamental flaw in their logic.
This idea that humans are inherently easy to manipulate.
That we're ultimately powerless against their tactics.
But we're not, are we?
Because we have this amazing capacity for growth, for change, for choosing something better.
Okay, so we've got knowledge, unity, and lost souls.
What about the other 4 vulnerabilities that Malignos mentions?
Well, the next one ties back to what we were just talking about.
It's the potential for redemption.
Redemption.
Malignos hates the idea that we're not defined by our past mistakes.
That we can learn and grow and become something more.
So even Malignos acknowledges that redemption is possible.
That even if we've fallen for their tricks in the past,
Even if we've made mistakes, we can still turn things around.
there's hope for us yet.
What else?
They're also worried about adaptation and evolution.
Their words, not mine.
Okay,
They're worried that people will take this knowledge and evolve beyond the reach of their tactics.
but there's a hint of desperation in their tone because they also admit that at their core,
Temptation-deception division.
these are their only real
Because
strategies.
they can change their tactics.
But they can't change their nature.
Deep down, they're still all about those same old tricks.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the 6th vulnerability.
The power of awareness.
Okay.
The very act of being conscious of these tactics.
Of shining a light on them makes us less susceptible to their influence.
It's like if you walk into a situation knowing there's a high chance someone might try to manipulate you.
You're going to be on high alert.
You're going to be looking for the signs, questioning your own reactions, and that makes all the difference.
Precisely.
And that brings us to Malignos' final.
And perhaps most revealing vulnerability.
Okay.
It's this almost pathetic plea at the end of their note.
Where they urge anyone who reads these letters to essentially,
Ignore everything they've just read.
okay, this is too good.
They're basically saying, hey, I just showed you the cheat codes to manipulating humanity, but please, for the love of all that is evil, don't actually use them. They're terrified of this information spreading, terrified of people waking up and realizing they have a choice.
So by urging people to ignore it,
Malignos is actually highlighting its importance.
it's like they're accidentally revealing just how powerful this knowledge really is.
Which is why this deep dive has been such a fascinating exercise.
By delving into the darkness, by understanding the tactics of manipulation.
We've actually stumbled into something much brighter.
Hope.
Okay, so we've unpacked a lot about how Malignos wants us to think and feel.
But there was a lot in those letters about specific actions.
Things that this being actually wants us to do.
I'm guessing these aren't exactly recipes for a fulfilling life.
Not exactly.
But they are fascinating insights into how seemingly small choices can have a ripple effect.
ultimately serving Malignos' agenda.
So what, like littering and stuff?
Even that.
Remember what we said about the smallest of infractions becoming like an avalanche?
Malignos loves to exploit that.
Take something like petty theft.
Someone swipes a candy bar from a gas station.
That doesn't exactly scream end of days.
True, but it's about what that act represents.
It's a transgression, a breaking of trust.
Multiply that by hundreds, thousands, millions of small transgressions.
And suddenly you've got a society where people are suspicious of each other.
Or no one feels safe.
It's like that saying, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.
Or as Malignos puts it, the smallest of infractions can be like a pebble that sets off an avalanche.
And the truly insidious part is that Malignos isn't just interested in the person committing the act.
They're even more interested in how they can exploit the victim in that situation.
So it's a lose-lose situation,
Or
right?
you steal the candy bar, you're on Malignos' turf.
But then the person you stole from, if they're not careful, Malignos wants to use that experience.
To make them bitter, resentful, vengeful, right?
Precisely.
Malignos wants to turn everyday interactions into breeding grounds for negativity.
Because the more we distrust each other, the more we buy into those narratives of fear and scarcity.
The easier we are to manipulate.
So how do we break the cycle?
If even seemingly insignificant actions can be twisted to serve Malignos' goals.
Where do we even begin to push back?
It starts by recognizing that we have a choice.
In every interaction, every decision, every moment?
We can choose to act in ways that align with fear, division, and scarcity.
Or we can choose actions rooted in love, connection, and abundance.
So instead of swiping the candy bar,
We buy it.
it's more than that.
It's about shifting our entire mindset.
Instead of seeing the world through a lens of scarcity,
There's not enough for everyone. I have to look out for myself.
we start seeing the world through a lens of abundance.
There's enough to go around.
How can I contribute to the collective good?
It sounds simple,
But I imagine it's not always easy.
especially when we're bombarded with messages of fear and division.
You're absolutely right.
It takes conscious effort, daily practice.
But the more we align our actions with those values of love, connection, and abundance,
The more we chip away at Malignos' influence.
because those are the things Malignos can't control.
So it's not just about fighting against darkness.
It's about building something better in its place.
Exactly.
It's about creating a world where those manipulative tactics are less effective.
A world where people are more connected, more compassionate, more resistant to those whispers of fear and division.
Okay, so we've talked about how Malignos tries to manipulate people on a societal level.
But what are their tactics for messing with our individual internal worlds?
Like our thoughts, our emotions, our sense of self.
That's where it gets really personal.
Because Malignos understands that if they can control how we think and feel on the inside,
They can control how we show up in the world,
so they're playing the long game.
aiming to reshape our very understanding of ourselves.
What's their strategy for that?
One of their favorite tools is something they call polluting spiritual intellectualism.
Polluting spiritual intellectualism.
It's about taking something that has the potential to be a source of growth and connection,
The exploration of our beliefs, the search for meaning.
and twisting it into something that breeds pride, division, and ultimately spiritual stagnation.
It's like they're saying, sure, go ahead and think about your beliefs.
Just don't you dare let it lead to genuine love service or, God forbid, actually changing your behavior.
Exactly.
They want us so caught up in the intellectual gymnastics of our faith or lack thereof,
But we miss the whole point.
which is to connect with something larger than ourselves, to cultivate compassion, to contribute to something bigger than ourselves.
So it's not about checking boxes or winning arguments.
It's about letting our beliefs transform us from the inside out.
Precisely.
And that kind of transformation is deeply threatening to Malignos.
Because it makes us less susceptible to their manipulations.
It allows us to tap into a source of strength and resilience that they can't touch.
So how do we know if we're falling into that trap?
Of polluted spiritual intellectualism.
What are the warning signs?
One sign is that our spiritual explorations
Instead of leading us to greater humility, greater compassion, greater service.
are actually making us feel more superior.
So instead of thinking, wow, there's so much I don't know, so much to learn,
We start thinking, man, I've got it all figured out.
I'm so much more enlightened than those people over there.
Exactly.
Another warning sign is that we become more interested in being right than in being loving.
More invested in defending our own perspectives than in understanding the perspectives of others.
It's like we're more interested in winning the argument than in building bridges.
Exactly.
And that's precisely the kind of division that Malignos loves to exploit.
Because when we're so busy building walls between ourselves and others...
It's easy to miss the ways we're all connected, the ways we're all part of something so much bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, so how do we course correct?
If we find ourselves slipping into that trap of spiritual superiority,
How do we get back on track?
humility is key.
Remembering that we don't have all the answers, that our understanding is always evolving.
And that the more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know.
So embracing that sense of wonder, that curiosity.
That openness to different perspectives.
Exactly.
And remembering that our spiritual exploration shouldn't just be about accumulating knowledge.
They should be about transforming us from the inside out.
Making us more compassionate, more loving, more engaged in the world around us.
It's about letting our beliefs inspire us to be better people.
To make a positive difference in the world.
Precisely.
And that's a kind of spiritual evolution that Malignos desperately wants to prevent.
Okay, so we've talked about how Malignos tries to mess with our beliefs, our actions, even our sense of self.
But they also seem to have a real vendetta against emotions.
Why is that?
Because emotions are powerful.
They can be our greatest allies or our worst enemies.
And Malignos knows this.
They want to exploit that power to turn our own emotions against us.
So instead of being guided by our hearts,
they want us ruled by our fears and insecurities.
Exactly.
And they're particularly adept at manipulating two very human experiences.
Peace and joy.
Wait, those are good things.
What's wrong with peace and joy?
Nothing.
When they're authentic and deeply rooted.
But Malignos understands that most of us crave those feelings.
And they're experts at offering counterfeit versions.
Counterfeit versions.
What does that even mean?
Well, think about how Malignos defines peace.
It's not that deep, abiding sense of tranquility that transcends circumstances.
It's more like the absence of conflict.
A moment of quiet amidst the chaos.
So like finally getting the kids to bed after a long day.
Exactly.
It's fleeting. It's circumstantial.
And most importantly, it's easily disrupted.
Which is exactly what Malignos wants.
Because as soon as that fleeting sense of peace disappears,
which it inevitably will,
they're right there waiting to exploit the resulting disappointment, frustration, maybe even anger.
Precisely.
They want us chasing after those fleeting moments of peace.
Never realizing that true peace, the kind that sustains us through difficult times,
comes from a much deeper source.
So how do we tell the difference between real peace?
In Malignos' counterfeit version,
authentic peace is rooted in something larger than ourselves.
It's not dependent on external circumstances.
It's a deep sense of knowing that no matter what's happening around us,
we are held, we are loved, we are okay.
That's beautiful.
But it also sounds kind of intangible.
How do we tap into that kind of peace?
It's about cultivating a relationship with that deeper source.
Whatever that looks like for you.
For some people, it's through prayer meditation, spending time in nature.
For others, it's through acts of service, connecting with loved ones, or creative expression.
So it's about finding those practices, those people, those places
that help us connect with that sense of peace that resides within each of us.
Exactly.
And the more we cultivate that connection,
the less power Malignos has over our emotional well-being.
So what about joy?
You said Malignos had a counterfeit version of that too.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about how we usually experience joy.
It's often attached to specific events, achievements, possessions.
Things that are, by their very nature, temporary.
So getting a promotion, buying a new car, finally finishing that home renovation project.
All those things that feel amazing in the moment, but then the feeling fades. And that's where Malignos steps in.
They want to keep us on that hedonic treadmill, constantly chasing after the next thing we think will make us happy.
So we end up feeling empty, dissatisfied.
Wondering why those fleeting moments of joy never seem to last.
Precisely.
Because true joy, the kind that Malignos hates,
isn't dependent on external circumstances.
It's a deep sense of contentment, of gratitude, of being present in each moment.
That arises from within.
So how do we cultivate that kind of joy?
How do we break free from that cycle of chasing after fleeting pleasures?
It starts with shifting our focus from what we lack to what we have.
It's about cultivating an attitude of gratitude for the simple things.
A warm, sunny day, a good cup of coffee, a meaningful conversation.
It's about finding joy in the ordinary.
In the everyday moments that make up our lives.
Exactly.
And it's about recognizing that true joy isn't something we achieve.
It's something we cultivate moment by moment.
Through our thoughts, our actions, and our connection to something larger than ourselves.
So it's about choosing joy.
Even when things are tough. even when we don't feel like it,
Precisely.
because that's when it matters most.
That's when it becomes a source of strength, a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the midst of darkness,
There's always light to be found.
wow, that's powerful.
But you know what else is powerful?
This realization that Malignos doesn't want us to have this conversation.
To be having these thoughts.
That's the irony of it all, isn't it?
Like trying to keep us in the dark. Malignos has inadvertently shown us the way to the light.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
From the depths of Malignos' manipulation tactics to the empowering reality of our own vulnerabilities.
But there's one more aspect we haven't touched on yet.
Responsibility?
What does Malignos have to say about that?
It's interesting.
Because they're not necessarily against responsibility itself.
In fact, they see it as another tool to manipulate.
They have this whole strategy of encouraging what they call misplaced responsibility.
Misplaced responsibility.
What's that all about?
It's about pushing people to the extremes.
Either they're crushed under the weight of their obligations.
Feeling like they have to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders.
So like the classic overachiever people pleaser always trying to save the day.
Exactly.
Or they swing to the other extreme.
Shirking responsibility altogether, becoming entitled, blaming others for their problems.
Refusing to acknowledge their own role in the situation.
It's like they're saying it's either all your fault or it's nobody's fault but yours.
Talk about a no-win situation.
Precisely.
Because both extremes lead to the same outcome.
Isolation.
When we're crushed under the weight of misplaced responsibility.
We push others away, believing we have to do it all ourselves.
And when we shirk responsibility altogether.
We become so focused on our own needs, our own perceived injustices.
That we lose sight of the needs of those around us.
It's like that whole give a man a fish versus teach a man to fish thing, right?
Malignos doesn't care if we're the ones giving the fish or demanding the fish.
As long as we're not working together to create a more sustainable, equitable solution. Because collaboration, cooperation, that sense of shared responsibility.
That's what Malignos fears most.
Because it's a direct threat to their whole divide and conquer strategy.
So how do we walk that line between taking on too much responsibility
And not taking enough.
How do we find that sweet spot of healthy responsibility?
It starts with self-awareness.
Being honest with ourselves about our own limitations, our own needs.
And recognizing that we're not superhuman.
We can't do it all, and that's okay.
It's like that oxygen mask analogy on airplanes.
You have to put on your own mask before you can help anyone else.
Precisely.
We have to prioritize our own well-being, our own mental and emotional health.
In order to show up as our best selves for others.
And that means setting boundaries, saying no when we need to, and asking for help when we need it.
But how do we balance that with our desire to make a difference?
To contribute to the greater good.
That's where discernment comes in.
We have to be selective about the responsibilities we take on.
Choosing those that align with our values, our passions, and our capacity.
And it means recognizing that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do
is to focus on our own growth, our own healing, our own journey towards wholeness.
Because the more whole, the more integrated we are within ourselves.
The more effectively we can show up in the world.
Exactly.
And that kind of wholeness, that sense of inner peace and grounded responsibility.
It's something Malignos can't manipulate or control.
It's about recognizing that we're not responsible for other people's choices.
But we are responsible to them.
Responsible to show up with love, with compassion, with an open heart, and a willingness to connect.
And that, in the end, is the antidote to Malignos' manipulative tactics.
It's about choosing connection over division, love over fear, and hope over despair.
Powerful stuff.
And you know what?
I think our listeners can use a moment to sit with that.
When we come back, one final thought from Malignos that really drives home the power of this knowledge we've uncovered. We're back, and
before we wrap up,
there's this one line from Malignos.
Almost a throwaway line.
That has really stuck with me.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
The part where they urge anyone who reads those letters to basically forget everything they've learned.
Exactly.
Like, hey, I just handed you the keys to the kingdom of manipulation, but whatever you do, don't use this information.
It's almost comical.
It is, but it's also incredibly revealing.
Because in that moment of desperation, Malignos accidentally highlights the very thing they fear most.
That people will actually use this knowledge, that they'll take it to heart and actually put it into practice.
So by urging us to ignore it,
Malignos is actually screaming at the top of their lungs just how important it is.
It's like reverse psychology on a cosmic scale.
Precisely.
It speaks to the power of awareness, the power of choice.
Malignos wants us to believe that we're powerless against their manipulations.
But the truth is, the moment we become aware of those tactics, we take back our power.
So this whole deep dive has been a bit of a judo move, hasn't it?
We've taken Malignos' own playbook and used it against them.
Exactly. By exposing those tactics, by shining a light on that darkness.
We've empowered ourselves. We've taken away that element of surprise.
Their ability to operate in the shadows.
So this isn't just about being informed.
It's about being transformed.
It's about taking this knowledge and using it to become more resilient, more connected, more compassionate.
It's about recognizing our own vulnerabilities so we can better support ourselves and each other.
And that's the challenge I want to leave with every listener today.
Don't just forget about it.
Don't let this information fade into the background noise of your life.
Take it to heart. Put it into practice.
Become a force for good in a world that desperately needs it.
Be the change, be the light.
Be the hope that Malignos fears most.
Perfectly said.
That's a wrap on this deep dive.
Remember, the choice is always yours.
Choose wisely.